So I like to start out by saying I'm somebody who desires to or aspires to not need an introduction. In this room, that actually might be true because I know a lot of you know me. But if you don't, by way of background, I am a corporate attorney by training and trade. But before that, I was a founder and I'm also a professor in NYU Sports Business Program. But I would like to kick it to the rest of these guys. So let's start in the room, Sean, and then Gaurav, and then we'll go around to the digital people like myself.
Thanks, Dan. This is Sean Smith. I'm the managing partner of Search Fund Ventures, and we invest in, like Marty said, individuals and partnerships that are acquiring small businesses, generally between $1 million to $3 million in EBITDA.
I'm Gaurav Mehta. Can you hear me? I'm Gaurav Mehta. I'm the founder and managing partner of Nation Capital. We're an independent sponsor focused here in New York City. We focus on investing in healthcare companies, typically adjusted EBITDA north of 3 million. We're in terms of healthcare, we focus on healthcare services, healthcare IT, digital health. We also look at business services companies where there's a healthcare angle. We have 4 companies in our portfolio today. We just closed an investment at the end of December of last year in a company called Frontier Direct Care. Great to meet you all.
Jeff, why don't you go so people know that you were not me, even though it says that you were me in the little box?
See that? Yeah, no, I'm Jeff Cree. I'm the managing partner and CEO of Atlantic Gulfstream Partners. We specialize in a compressed roll-up strategy, creating 9 figures in enterprise value within 24 months or less. We focus on lower middle market like the rest of you guys, 1 to 3 million EBITDA, middle market Main Street businesses. We leverage their operational improvements, strategic acquisitions, and financial engineering to drive rapid growth and outsized returns. Our approach is a little bit different than other people's. I've been doing this for a while and figured out that we can close on 7, 8 businesses at once. We don't need to take 10 years in a regular fund structure. And we do that rapidly and get it back on the market and sell it. And we're able to capture the high net worth investment money into those shorter 18 to 24 month lockups. Whereas traditional, these things are reserved for, institutional money in a 10-year fund.
Ali, last but not least.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ali Taha. I'm managing partner of Memphis Capital. Memphis Capital is a fund based out of London, UK, with the objective to search for and acquire an SME Egypt. And we are looking for the typical search fundable targets of SMEs between 5 to 30 million in ticket size, and with the very typical search fund target criteria.
Okay, Ali, I'm going to come back to you because you live in a tough neighborhood, geopolitically speaking, when it comes to geopolitical and other sorts of risks. But broadly speaking, the way I wanted to kick this off is that, and I'm sure the answer is different for all of you, but generally speaking, for your different businesses, what are the characteristics of a good deal for you? And feel free to get as specific as you want to be. And Jeff, I'll start with you just because you changed your name and people know you're not me.
Okay, sure. I'd be happy to answer that. A good deal for me is probably very similar to what you guys also look at, right? I mean, we want recurring revenue. We don't want a lot of concentration risk, at least 7 years in business. And a company that we can look at and quickly say, yes, we can add value to this business. And if we can't do that quickly, then it's probably a pass.
John and Gaurav?
Sure. We're a bit different than your traditional independent sponsor. We look for businesses that are redefining the way things are done. So there's a large angle of innovation that we look for when we're investing. And if it's an older school, old world model, we bring our own resources to bring them into an innovative model. We've, as a result, have outsized returns. It's proven pretty well for us. We've never scored less than a 40% IRR in any of our investments. I think it's just has to go back with, hey, if there's somebody who's got a really robust value proposition, good unit economics, strong management team, those kind of three big picture items, you tend to do pretty well.
I'm just going to add a little addendum question to this question, and I'll stick with you, Gaurav. Can you be specific about a deal that you've done in recent memory that fit all those criteria?
Every deal I've ever done. So let's start with my oldest deal. It was a company called Direct Shifts. We made an investment in that in 2018. That company was disrupting the way healthcare staffing works. Traditionally, a lot of staffing agencies will use phone call, email, text. They're like a nuisance, really, to doctors to try to get doctors and nurses to take on shifts or a travel nurse assignment. Stupid way of doing things, and it was archaic. And this is like circa 2015. And, you know, there were a handful of companies that saw that there was a better way of doing things, and Direct Shifts was one of them. And they wanted to create an app and technology enable the entire process. So the question is, why does that matter? Why would you care? Okay, I get an app now. Why is that better? Well, simply put, you automated the entire order fulfillment process for the hospital. And now your recruiters can actually focus on bringing in new nurses onto your platform versus filling out orders for the hospital. And so what that does is it reprioritizes your front office to really do amazing things and drive growth. And you saw every one of these tech-enabled platforms dramatically grow. I'm talking about, 100+% year-over-year CAGRs upon launch. And why? Nurses, physicians did not want to interact with somebody over the phone. And recruiters wanted to be able to spend more time driving for growth. And so we knew that this was going to be a big deal. And so we made that investment. We exited that in 2022 to Sorrent Capital, which is a growth equity shop out of San Francisco, for a 14x MOIC. And so that is a great example, a case study. Our firm brought the largest customer that they have to date, even today, Cross County's health system. And so that's the value add we brought on top of sort of being able to be a sounding board for the CEO and founder to talk who was new to healthcare, and to really provide a lot of advice, free advice and insights beyond just also bringing their biggest customer. And so that's probably the most relevant one I could talk about for case study. Obviously, every one of the investments we've done have had that kind of J curve. The next one we did was a company called Persimmon. They do Botox and med spa treatments in the home. Tim Draper, who's been a guest in the past, is actually an investor in the name. And they are really trying to disrupt the med spa, vertical, which is a brick and mortar business, by bringing all those treatments into the home. Another J curve. It's growing really rapidly. Smarter way to book and get things done, and it brings people in the convenience of their home. Another one we did recently was another healthcare staffing marketplace similar to Direct Shifts. That was 2 years ago, and it was a company called GoTo. And similar to Direct Shifts, almost identical, except targeting the dental industry, which at the time nobody was doing. And also just dramatic J curve kind of growth since. And then finally, our most recent one, which has already grown over 100% in just the first 3 months of us investing in it, is a company called Frontier Director, which we closed at the end of 2027. And they are on the forefront of healthcare innovation and delivering primary care. They do use a brick and mortar model to drive engagement between their physicians and patients. Their value proposition is unique in the market. It provides a concierge medicine service, but to blue collar, gray collar workers. And the reason why that matters is because those people are driving the cost of care up like crazy. They always go to the ER. I'm gonna say those people, but I mean that segment is of economic segment. And with the concierge medicine service, what we found was with all that engagement with their primary care physician, they stopped using the ER. And so the value proposition to the employers who are paying for this is incredibly valuable. And we're seeing, again, similar J curve growth, 100% plus CAGRs every year.
I understand why the Botox one was successful, because everyone these days is looking for a smoother forehead. So, that makes sense. Sean, same question. If you remember the prompt, which is, what is a good deal? What are the characteristics of a good deal? And what's an example of one that you've done recently? Go ahead.
Yeah, so, our thesis revolves, we keep it a lot more simple than Gangaro does, but we focus on businesses that provide essential products and services to attract event markets. So what that means is, we only invest in companies that offer mission critical products, call it a component manufacturer for a much larger manufacturing process. Maybe they produce really small pieces, $5,000 widget that goes into a multi-million dollar piece of machinery. And it's spec'd into that. That's a great example of a mission critical part, right? We also invest in your classic trade contractor strategies. So HVAC roll-ups, electrical contractors, things of that nature, necessary to keep the lights on, right? So that's really the overarching concept. And then back to some of what Jeff said, right? Always want to see, ideally low customer concentration, high quality revenue, that's recurring or reoccurring in nature, that has high switching costs for those customers to, remain purchasing from that company. So you put all that together, you get a great deal. Now, to Dan's point, there's always going to be hair, right? And these businesses are small. Generally, we're looking at businesses that, are in the $1 million to $2 million range, doing some closer to $3 million. There's always going to be a bit of customer concentration if it's a commercial strategy, or a government, a B2G strategy. And there's always going to be key person risk, which I think was talked about quite a bit on the prior panel, right? So you need to make sure that the seller, if family's going to stay on with the business, people are really bought in. The sponsor, the buyer is going to be a great steward for the new business. And then, lastly, that you've got incentive alignment, at least for us and for our investors, with the sponsor themselves. And that's so critical because if the sponsor is going to be driving the business going forward, but there's misalignment, say there's a really high management fee or there's large transaction fees, rather than a strong carried interest structure, all of a sudden you're going to start marching in slightly different directions. So those are kind of the qualities we look for. A great example, we recently invested in a sewer inspection and maintenance business that services the Chesapeake Bay area. It's doing about 2.8 million in EBITDA. It has customer concentration because that you can count on your hands how many water utilities and municipalities there are in that Chesapeake Bay area, that are sizable enough to contract this company. But at the end of the day, the contracts in place are 3 to 5 year contracts with 2-year options to extend, and there's guarantees baked into those contracts and strong non-termination language. So we felt very comfortable that despite the customer concentration risk there's mitigants in place to keep that revenue, those reoccurring streams of cash coming in the door. On top of that, you can mitigate that specific kind of acute idiosyncratic risk through the deal structure itself. So there's a kind of, I'd call it an element that's a bit esoteric to the search fund space called a forgivable seller note, which in effect is the same as an earnout. But essentially, people use these notes as a way to bake in and kind of mitigate risks related to potential declines in earnings or in revenue post-close. And you can think of it as, the purchase price, that note itself will be decreased dollar for dollar. If revenue declines, you can attach it to a specific customer, and so on and so forth. So those are kind of the varying ways we mitigate those acute risks if we can't get the full package in a single deal.
Same question to you, but one little wrinkle, which is what does a good deal look like in a market like Egypt? I've got so many Egypt and Middle East questions for you that we might just eat up most of that time because I'm fascinated, but go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So, well, like search fund is a search fund pretty much everywhere in the world, but in emerging markets has like a little bit of different twist in terms of growth specifically. So, like hearing the criteria from the other gents, from Jeff and from Gaurav and Sean, it's very similar, but an extra element that I'm looking for is high growth, and that's what makes emerging markets a bit different. So the like when we are talking about high growth in emerging markets, we are talking about like at least 30-40% growth every year for the company.
What kind of businesses are you looking at in emerging markets specifically? As if it's similar or different than more developed markets like the United States.
It's pretty much the same, but we are more focused on like a little bit less focus on services and soft kind of companies, and more focus on light processing, light manufacturing type of businesses. So we're looking at more value creation businesses. Some of them are still in the services industry, but like we are tapping on the industries that kind of like add more value from the cheap labor perspective, from the cheap raw material, etc., and focus on companies that export their products and services to Europe, US, or or even the neighboring regions like the Middle East and Africa.
Got it. Jeff, I'm gonna kick it back to you for this question, which is, given that a lot of these businesses are, when you're dealing with a small to medium-sized business, you're often dealing with a business that's either family-owned or has been in a family for a long time and is not necessarily super sophisticated in business, but they're good at what they do. They're good at HVAC, they're good at roofing, they're good at plumbing, et cetera, whatever kind of trade it might be. How do you manage the diligence risk in what you do, especially in a roll-up strategy of the kind that you employ?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. But as it relates to the family, we have a pretty strict policy that we send anybody for all the family to the board, and they operate from a board level. One of the first things we look at, and I probably should have mentioned this, and what does a good deal look like, is a strong number two. If the business can't operate without the owner, to us, it's not a business that's worth buying. So that's one of the first things we do is say, how strong is this? How strong is the management team? And how strong is the number two that's going to step up? So yeah, we do. It doesn't matter what their involvement is, how good they are. We put them on the board, and we bring in. We either bring in a guy to do it, or number two, him or her, or we'll coach up one of the existing management staffs before we close and make sure that we're in the best position to succeed.
Or is that different in what you do, considering you're kind of singularly focused in healthcare, or is the diligence risk similar in terms of, or is there more sophistication in healthcare related businesses? Or
What was that question? Sorry.
it's okay. Yeah, I don't listen when I talk half the time either, so that's all right. So the question was, in your line of work, for especially in healthcare businesses, is there that unique kind of diligence risk that there is in other small to medium-sized businesses in terms of lack of sophistication or lack of proper bookkeeping, or things that that represent risks to the overall investment from a diligence standpoint?
Yeah, like I think the biggest risk, and we're seeing it right now, is regulatory risk. That's unique to healthcare. Whether we like it or not, healthcare is funded by Medicare, Medicaid. A large chunk of it is. And so, and that Medicare and Medicaid are serving oftentimes seniors, and seniors represent 80% of the cost in healthcare. And so the biggest risk in healthcare is regime change and changes to the regulatory environment. And so right now, the Trump administration is talking about a $7 or $8 billion cut to Medicaid funding, or maybe it was even larger than that. I might be misquoting. But the impact on that is massive, because there are home health, nursing homes, anything in the post-acute space is heavily reliant on Medicaid funding. And so if that dries up, what does that mean for all those people? What does that mean for all those businesses? And so we as a result are not looking at anything right now in Medicaid until there's some more clarity around what the future looks like for Medicaid under the current regime. And then when we think about other areas that are unique to healthcare, I'd say from a diligence standpoint, there's this whole unique thing called revenue cycle management. And it is focused on how you bill for services rendered if you're a provider organization. And it is a big key to success as a provider organization. And without going into too much detail, you really want to diligence that thoroughly. You want to make sure there's no fraud going on. You also want to make sure that there's opportunity for you potentially to drive potentially more revenue per patient into the table. meaning you're leaving maybe some stuff off the table that you're not doing a good job of coding, for example. So, one of the key areas of diligence in any provider business is that RCM function. And I would say there's a whole bunch of others, right? But those are probably the two biggest that most people talk about or know about.
Yeah, I put fraud is bad at the top of most of my diligence checklists. Sean, why don't you go ahead?
Sorry, say that again to me.
Yeah, same question to you, which I think we talked about this the other day, which is like, when you're dealing with these sorts of businesses, what kind of, especially in your sectors that you're looking at, in these essential businesses, what kind of diligence risks are there and how do you mitigate those?
Yeah, and just to clarify a little bit more about our approach, we're almost one layer removed from the actual company, the actual acquisition process itself. Because in a sense, we're investing into someone like Gaurav, who's a sponsor of the deal. So to a large extent, we're vetting the sponsor, we're reviewing their diligence, and then we'll come in and conduct our own business diligence, but we'll rely on their quality of earnings. It's mandatory for us that folks get a quality of earnings done, that they have legal, third-party legal counsel involved to draft documents and run red flags and run legal diligence, all that stuff. So while we aren't doing the actual quarterbacking of the diligence process, we're in there with the sponsor, reviewing everything, and kind of providing feedback on where we'd like to see more. So that's kind of just the backdrop and how our diligence process probably differs from, pretty much everyone else on this panel. But what we look for is going to be very similar, right? And to specifically talk about, essential businesses, the types of companies we focus on, we certainly review contracts. We want, like I talked about with the sewer business, right? We want to make sure that there's, a true kind of long-term relationship and contractual obligations baked in if we're relying or underwriting the deal with a recurring revenue type thesis. You'll see certain contracts, especially in kind of government contracting space, where there's a long-term contract in place that's represented. When you look at it, there's, a ceiling of maybe $10 million, but there's no guarantee and it's all purchase order based. So at the end of the day, it's really just a fixed pricing contract that doesn't really add much value. So really understanding the contracts is one piece of diligence we look at. And that again underpins revenue quality. We look at net revenue retention really closely because that tells a great story. Again, this essential business thesis is all about steady, maybe some degree of revenue volatility depending on how much exposure there might be to kind of larger projects or things of that nature. But you can really learn a lot about a business and its customer relationships by looking at net revenue retention. How much are they upselling each year? How much are they downselling? How many customers are churning? And then how much of that revenue growth is driven by new customers, right? So if you understand those four drivers, you can just learn a ton about the quality of revenue. I focus a lot on revenue, but gross margin is probably number 3 that's critical to us. If you have a sustainable gross margin, you can conceivably outgrow your fixed costs. And that's some of what you were talking about with unit economics, right? As long as you have a really sustainable and quality gross profit profile, the company's, probably in pretty good shape and you can iron out the kinks in its fixed cost structure. So that's kind of the third piece, but there's a ton more. It gets more and more idiosyncratic with each deal, but those are I'd say the 3 high-level areas to focus on.
Fair enough. Ollie, so Gaurav alluded to legislative regime change risk. How do you manage risk like that? What do you call it? Political risk, geopolitical risk, et cetera, in an emerging market like Egypt? Like, what are specific things that you have run into, or what are specific things that you stay away from in emerging markets?
So when it comes to a few things, I mean, geopolitical risks are kind of like out of our hands and we cannot really control them, but we take this in consideration in terms of valuation, in taking a factor for pretty much like everything, like political risk, economical risk, change in legislations, change in taxation regimes. But for the past couple of years, we have seen like some improvement in the pretty much like governmental legislations in Egypt. And there's like a lot of encouragement from the government towards the M&A ecosystem in general, but also like inviting foreign investors, DFIs, to invest in the local market. And since 2018, we have seen like a big flow of foreign investors going for either acquisitions or like we don't really have like a strong ecosystem for search funds yet in Egypt. I'm still trying to build the foundation for it, but we have like a very good track record for private equities, for also like sovereign wealth funds from the region who are going to invest in Egyptian companies. Yeah, we pretty much take such risks into consideration by factoring it in the valuation of the businesses. So we typically like put our offers at like roughly around 0.7, 0.8 of the typical PAR companies in other regions or in developed markets.
Can risks like this also be considered opportunities? And if so, how do you trade that?
Yeah, I mean, for example, some of the companies we looked at over the past year was companies in the food and beverage area, and specifically companies that are using local produce from the Egyptian market, from the Egyptian agriculture, tapping on, yeah, like some risks that happened in other regions. Like, for example, in Europe last year, there was a big impact from climate change, and some of the agricultural products, they got impacted. And Egypt has like a very great agricultural industry here. So there are a lot of companies that use the opportunity and sort of focus on like some markets like UK, like Germany, like France, to export their products. Yeah, this is like the kind of opportunities that we get in the region. But there is like another thing, because I wasn't living in Egypt before I started my search fund. I was living mostly in Europe, and one of the main reasons that made me like come to emerging market and specifically to Egypt to do the search fund here was the enormous space of potential and prospects for local companies. I mean, the Egyptian market is relatively big by volume, like it's 120 million in population. But a lot of Egyptian businesses, they are exporting their products and services to both the Middle East and the African region, and in specific industries also to Europe and US. So these are the opportunities that we are looking at, the companies that either exporting their products or have potential to export their products to other markets.
That makes sense. Jeff, I've seen you've gone back to your stage name, Dan Marcus. Sorry, I'm just gonna keep doing this.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Until I find better material, which is probably not going to happen. But on a serious note, as a corollary to what Ali was talking about, obviously we're 5 weeks essentially into a new regime, into a new administration in the United States. Does that change of administration present opportunities as far as different kinds of deals, different kinds of sectors, different kinds of businesses that you look at, or is it status quo?
For me, it's status quo. Although, you know, at a previous independent sponsor team I was on with Black Ocean Capital, we had pretty close ties to President Trump, had some events at Mar-a-Lago, fundraising events. So I think personally, it's a great thing, and that, you know, it'll drive more, you know, I think for us, it just gives investors more confidence, I think, in what we're doing. That's my personal opinion, but you know, I mean, it's not going to change one way or the other our you know, our thesis and how we execute.
John, what about you, Gaurav? I know it's probably the opposite for your business, but is there any opportunity in the new administration as far as either, you know, different businesses that you look at or different businesses that you're invested in?
Yeah, I guess, you know, we like to think the beauty of our thesis is it's pretty agnostic to, you know, who's in the Oval Office and any types of kind of regulations. The one, I would say, thematic item that we had been incorporating into our thesis, even, earlier, much more earlier than kind of, the regime change, is the kind of reshoring of both supply chains and manufacturing in general. So I think that catalyst, we've seen it play out in some of the kind of contract manufacturing companies we've looked at and have continued to follow. But otherwise, I guess the only other one would be we have looked a lot at deals in Canada, and we've paused a little bit on that just because of uncertainty around, tariffs. The tariffs generally wouldn't impact the businesses we're looking at since they're service-based and kind of domestic focused, but currency risk would be at play in those scenarios. So we're a little slower there. It would certainly need to be a higher bar.
Okay, Gaurav, this is your opportunity to complain about Medicaid. Go for it.
Look, I think healthcare generally has kind of followed pretty big picture themes of how do we reduce costs? How do we reduce costs, right? So as long as you're on that side of the equation, you generally have done pretty well, barring any regime change. This is the first regime, I think, that's come in that's maybe trying to take a huge sledgehammer to Medicare or Medicaid. And so for those reasons, we're pausing on those, as I said earlier. But I think there's some opportunity too. I mean, if you look at what Secretary Kennedy has said, chronic care management is going to be a key area of focus for him in prevention. We have a healthcare system that's economically incentivized by curing disease, or not curing it, but treating it. And it's not really around how do you prevent it from happening. If you really want to stop all the healthcare issues, you got to hit on food. You got to hit on lifestyle. There's a lot of areas to hit on. But the incentive scheme today does not support that. And so there are models that are going to be coming around, and we're very, very much in touch with parties who are very close to the administration. There are going to be some new care models coming around and incentive schemes that are going to be pretty impactful. And so, we're staying in touch and on the forefront of that as we think about what to invest in. And so there's plenty of opportunity. Regime change doesn't mean not always a dirty bad thing. It can also be a good thing. You just got to know where to play and always just think about the big picture themes. As long as you're on the right side of the equation, you generally do pretty well.
Yeah, I just want to real quick. We've got a little bit less than 20 minutes left. So I was wondering, some of you guys have done multiple search funds or acquired multiple businesses. Can you talk about, number one, why you got into the search fund business? Number one. Second, how did you figure you wanted to do more than one? And how have you become systematic at it, right? Like, some of you. Explore it more.
You want me to start there? Or?
Yes.
So I guess just to double down on kind of the point I made earlier, we invest into searchers. So we actually, I guess last year we looked at probably 150 or so different deals that came to us from searchers and independent sponsors, which is sort of the language used. But to kind of go all the way to the top to where Marty started this, Mark Sinatra is a pretty, I would say, well-known figure in the space. He ran what's called a traditional search fund, which is what it sounds like Ali is doing, where you raise, 200, 400, maybe 500K for the search process itself. And in most cases, individuals who do that will become the CEO of the company they acquire after acquisition. That's different from Gaurav's model. Correct me if I'm wrong, to some degree. But
yeah, that's right. I think independent sponsors are focused on acquiring and building a portfolio like a private equity fund would have. And where we differ, I think, from traditional private equity is we tend to build bespoke LP bases for each deal that can be highly strategic to that investment you're making. And the second thing is at least at our shop, we're very involved in the day-to-day. And a lot of independent sponsors tend to be very involved in the day-to-day with the companies that they are acquiring or investing behind.
So the point I was going to put at the end of that, there's another kind of in-between type of persona, which is called the self-funded searcher. And those are individuals who will search for a company to acquire, and their intention is to become the CEO of it post-close. So they'll acquire one company, but they won't raise any capital to fund the search phase. They'll self-fund it, or they'll work a W-2 job while they look for this business to acquire. So we invest in all three. We don't invest in the traditional search phase, so we won't fund people to go find a business. But when they find a business, if they need additional capital to acquire it, We can provide preferred equity to do that alongside debt that they'll use. And then we invest into self-funded search deals and independent sponsor deals as well. So to kind of, right, we don't provide the seed money, but we provide the acquisition financing, right, as a preferred equity security. So to kind of tie a bow on it, to Marty's question, the kind of three, there's kind of two, ambitions we see for searchers, traditional and self-funded. A lot of those folks are, pretty entrepreneurial. They come from maybe a little more towards the operating type backgrounds. They want to be a CEO. They want to be a leader and potentially want to do it again after they run this first search and exit. Some of them want to hold it for the long term and just have one quality business that they run. Independent sponsors typically come to us saying they want to build a portfolio, sort of akin to a private equity firm. And many of them have ambitions to ultimately raise, a PE fund with committed capital, right? So that's kind of the two career trajectories that we see in the space.
Marty, you still asking questions or am I back on here?
I mean, maybe, yeah.
Systematic in how we diligence or?
How you do it from your deals, etc.
Yeah, I mean, and the way we find our deals tends to be we try to focus on proprietary deal flow. We'll occasionally look at, broker processes, but we find that by doing proprietary deal flows and going for a thematic way of investing versus just being more proactive about what we invest in versus reactive, not to say we don't react as well, is a better way to go about investing. And the reason why is because we develop an investment thesis around a specific vertical. What do we want to do and why is that going to add value? And then once we sort of establish that, then we go and talk to all the founders, entrepreneurs, companies in the sector and get to know them all. And it gives you a lot of insight on who's doing what, why one's better than the other, or how they differentiate themselves. And then you build a relationship. And what I found, at least as an independent sponsor, is because you don't have a fund, it's incredibly difficult to get somebody to want to sell their company to you when you're fundless. It's just, especially in a banker process. With a proprietary deal process, the founders tend to be a lot more open because you have a thesis. You have probably a whole bunch of targets to go do a roll up with, for example, or if that's the thesis. And so you're bringing some of the table that's actually value add to the organization. And that's how you differentiate yourself as an independent sponsor and that kind of thing. In terms of a diligence and to get to your question around it being systematic, a lot of our systematic approach is a lot of diligence up front on sort of developing the investment thesis. Then when you get into the business, we're looking at, sort of customer concentration, contract terms, recurring revenue, employee attrition, customer attrition, litigation, quality of earnings and quality of revenue, bookkeeping. What's on the team today? What do we need to bring to the table to support the team and make them better? And so there's I mean, I don't want to say it's like a checklist, but every situation is unique, and you got to understand kind of what's the landscape in that business today, and what does that imply from a potential risk perspective, and then how do you mitigate that or get comfortable with that risk?
Proprietary deal flow is also the name of my yacht rock band, so it's by coincidence.
If you get involved in Medicaid and you're going to buy companies that generate revenue from Medicaid, they're involved in it. You got to look at the other side of the equation. The Medicaid is a state program. It's corrupt. I can tell you that because I know what I'm talking about because I ran it. I ran part of it. That's
a lightning round.
There's a tremendous amount.
This isn't being recorded, is it?
It's a lightning round. We're supposed to be going fast.
Well, but it's important for him. If you're going to buy a company, you have to know whether or not how much revenue they're getting and is it
Exactly.
Is it legitimate revenue?
Totally.
That's key.
Oh yeah.
Because if it isn't, you're gonna when someone like me went after the people to get back the money, find out what your company's worth after that.
Totally. And same with Medicare, right? So Medicaid is 50% funded by the federal government. That is correct. It's a state program. And then Medicare also, you got to deal with people who do proper billing or, just got to look out for that. You got to get really good consultants to help you with that.
Dan?
Back to me. Okay, cool. So my question, kicking it back to Jeff here. So a lot, the way that you guys all make money is by maximizing the potential. I'm simplifying, but is maximizing the potential of businesses that have not maximized their potential. What are the reasons that you find that these businesses have either plateaued or not being able to, reach their full potential as a business? And what are the things, in addition to capital, that you bring to the table in order to get to that point?
Yeah, from my perspective, they focus on organic growth and not inorganic growth, and that's kind of, I didn't get touched on the proprietary deal flow, but we invested a lot in that. We have our partners are also coaches that see 50, 60 businesses a quarter come through their doors. It's right in our strike zone. So we're well aware of their problems and what they're dealing with, and they don't know how to do acquisitions. And even if they did, it would take all their time and they would probably drop sales. So from our perspective, they just don't focus enough on inorganic growth.
Ollie, what about you? Same question.
Pretty much the same. Like we are looking for companies that doesn't require like big capex or big injection of extra funds post acquisition to grow. So and for again, like going back to the emerging market story. So it is quite easier to find companies that are like still profitable, positive cash flow, growing, etc. But with sort of like some aspects of mismanagement or not focusing on the right elements of growing the company. And also what I heard like quite often from specifically family businesses are like, hey, we have grown the company to a certain ceiling and we don't have the management capacity or the strategy to grow the business further. So we are looking for people to come and buy the business and have the capacity to grow the business. So these are the typical deals we are looking at.
Is complacency a big factor? And that was one. And then two, are there cultural barriers for someone that does something along the lines of what you do in an emerging market? Because if you come to somebody who is in agriculture and you say, well, I have a big check for you, they also probably say, well, I have a bridge for you to buy. So, what does that look like?
Yeah. So again, there's like some cultural differences, of course. But for example, like when I was looking at the search funds in Europe, and by the way, I'm investing in my personal capacity in search funds in Europe. I see it's quite common that when the people are coming to a retirement age, they are looking for ways to exit their business. In emerging markets, it's a little bit less. Like last year, I was analyzing a company where the CEO is like 88 years old. So and the guy is continuing, like he doesn't have any plan to retire. And also like the families are typically slightly bigger than the average in Europe. So again, the typical succession challenge that we find in family businesses in Europe is a little bit less in Egypt, but nonetheless, we still find a lot of people like first or second generation of founders of businesses, and they are looking to exit either because they don't have a following generation or the following generation is not interested in running the business afterwards. So these are typically the businesses and the companies in our pipeline.
Good segue, because Sean, you and I talked about this, and I spend way too much time on X, formerly known as Twitter, and I see a lot of people talking about how there's this untapped opportunity among the baby boomer generation who have founded small to medium-sized businesses but don't hang a succession plan, a family member that wants to take it over, any options for liquidity. How real and how big is this opportunity in your experience and in your impressions?
So there's kind of and I think some of this was covered in the prior panel, but the statistic that the New York Times and it's kind of quoted in the papers is that there's almost $7.5 trillion of assets held by the baby boomer generation, and it's maybe 80% or so of that in Gen X. So there's going to be these continuous waves of retiring business owners that need succession plans. And a lot of the prior panels, discussion centered around, well, what do you do if, another family member doesn't want to take over the business, and how do you kind of manage through that? So that was really when Jim Southern, who's credited with running the first search fund alongside Irving Grusbeck, when they kind of went after this, that was the thesis, right? It was, hey, we can provide a unique alternative to lower middle market PE, and we can be, a more trusted partner, quote unquote, to retiring business owners. And I think it's proven out to be a really attractive option for many folks that are interested in, maintaining their legacy, keeping some degree a little bit closer to the business that they sell, and that sort of thing.
I have a quick question. So, we did a panel in San Francisco 10 years ago of a bunch of private equity firms. And they said that every deal they looked at, even lower middle market ones, had some kind of business broker behind it, et cetera. So what percent of the deals that you look at as a search fund already have a business broker? Most, not many. Does a business broker get involved once you say you have an interest? Thoughts?
Yeah, I can comment on this across the various types of search funds and, across the hundreds of deals we've looked at. But it's really specific to, an individual's process. Like Gaurav, I'll pass it to you after, you'll probably say all of our stuff is proprietary, which is different, right? So most search funds, I think, probably 60 to 70% of the self-funded search deals that we see, which are these people who, are funding the process of finding a business to acquire themselves, 60 to 70% of those end up being backed by a business broker. And just to set it's a lot of them. Yeah. And it's oftentimes people who have a really broad thesis. So not a focused thesis on healthcare. It's I just want to find something that's local to, Asheville, North Carolina, that is a stone's throw from my home and, does $1 million in earnings, right? Those kinds of theses that are really broad, maybe location specific, tend to end up falling to a brokered business. The folks that say, hey, we're really centered on, great healthcare businesses with strong unit economics and a specific kind of potentially recapitalization opportunity or something like that, those are going to probably be proprietary deals. Because there are brokers that specialize a bit more, but you start getting into the territory of, real bona fide middle market investment banks. And then you start getting into really competitive processes with lower middle market PE. And the whole point of this, micro cap PE is that you're not competing with lower middle market PE, right? You're buying things at 3 to 5x EBITDA multiples. You're not getting into a competitive process where you end up paying 8 to 12 times. So that's kind of, I'd say, the high level across the deals we've seen, but it's probably good for you to provide a counterpoint.
Yeah, I would say candidly, most processes are banked. You gotta deal with that if you want to, from a particularly with sell side opportunities. And so our approach and how we're able to do proprietary deals, we start as a minority oftentimes, and we sort of, these are fast growing businesses, so they're going to be cash hungry, and so we build our position over time and get to control. And we typically take board control regardless, and we have operating control. I mean, all the controls in place, but it's a minority investment potentially. And so you get really high quality deal flow that way, because you're getting the best management teams in place, because these are driven founders who want to continue in the business. And you're also but you get the benefit of having all the control that you would in a majority transaction. So that's how we do it for proprietary. I think for buyout, I would say probably 90% are still going to end up being a brokered process.
Marty, do you have more questions in the room? Or
Yes. Are we in a period of, because of high interest rates, of more owner financing?
Absolutely. I think if you're a smart investor, you are structuring your deals with earnout, seller note, pref equity. We do all of the above, right? So they're I think highly structured transactions are pretty normal right now.
And I'll just give you an example. I had a guy come out of COVID, and he said that he was turning around a company, and originally he had agreed to buy this company if he could turn around to positive revenue. It was a negative, but it had a very strong market niche. So he had agreed to, if he turned it around to profitability, he would pay $1 million for it. COVID hit, and the owner agreed to finance everything. He would take it over if he turned it around for nothing, because the owner just wanted to get out. So why don't you guys continue on different things, agreements or covenants you're seeing?
Yeah, so we published about a month and a half ago a study that had a bunch of different data on the self-funded search and independent sponsor world, specifically deals, below the kind of $5 million EBITDA range. And the statistic we saw on deferred consideration as a percentage of total sources of acquisition financing was 17% of total sources. So that's, that includes rolled equity. It includes seller financing, a seller note typically, and it includes earnouts in there as well.
We like making big use of liquidation preferences. So some earnout, there's pluses and minuses to earnout versus liquidation preference, but typically somebody who thinks their business is going to grow like crazy is going to prefer a lick pref over an earnout. So anyways, you sort of play with both.
And Jeff, your thoughts?
Yeah. So yeah, we do a very similar structure. We do have a big rollover component since we're closing on 7 businesses at one time. That's how we kind of get to a blended 7.5 multiple for the founder. And it's double what they would get selling to a strategic buyer on just a one-off deal. So that's kind of where, I don't do seller financing. Our typical model is 60% first wire. And then the rest of it we'll do in earn out and rollover equity. But it's investors always love the earn out component. So I foresee that earn out maybe even stretching to 30% in the near future.
So if you take a time machine, you go back to 2009, you see a lot of assets go up for sale that you could just acquire on assumption of debt. I've seen businesses that were so heavily indebted to like the equivalent of hard money lenders to business, and these guys are actually, they're probably calling you at 5 o'clock every day to lend you money, right? And they're lending at 17%, 18%, 25%, right? And I've seen guys come to me and they're like, we're a profitable business, but we have a piece of debt that's 20%. I'm like, wow. I mean, how are you going to pay that over long? How are you going to have growth, right? So do you come across those deals? Do you work out the debt? Do you only acquire the assets? Talk about it, please.
Ooh, one thing to add to this, Marty, is that since COVID, a subchapter 5 of chapter 11 has sort of mooted some of those deals because it's a really effective tool for businesses that qualify in this sort of world. Talk to the bank.
Can you describe that more? Can you describe it more?
Yeah, sure. So subchapter 5, and I'm not a bankruptcy attorney, so I'm not the guy to talk to, but I've shepherded a company through this in conjunction with a bankruptcy attorney. If you're a business that qualifies from a revenue standpoint, and in terms of your revenue is below a certain threshold, and that's been set by Congress and changes. So up until recently, it was about 7 million in top line, or it might have been 7 million in EBITDA. I got to double check. It is a streamlined chapter 11 process that allows the debtor to remain in possession throughout the pendency of the chapter 11, or the subchapter 5. But you can go from going into chapter 11 or subchapter 5 and being through with a plan of reorganization that crams down debt to as much as like 10 cents on the dollar, or as little as 10 cents on the dollar.
Wow.
In 3 months, which is what we did, which is
amazing,
powerful tool.
Unbelievable. Keep on, guys. Thoughts? Do you acquire assets versus without debt? Do you acquire the company? Thoughts?
So we don't do distress buyouts. I'll partner with another independent sponsor who happens to be my cousin on that. That's all he does. You can do. I've heard of like Article 9s. So it's another way to clean up a business. But when you're buying a company that's in distress, you can go to the lender and try to negotiate a deal, right, and restructure the debt. That's one way to do it. And if that doesn't work, then if the company's going to go into bankruptcy, it goes into bankruptcy. You got to try to get it out of bankruptcy, which we do go after companies that are already in bankruptcy.
So you're not combing divorce and obituary pages, I guess.
No, I'm not.
Jeff?
Marty, how much time do we have left? And
about -2 minutes.
Okay. So
one last question. Why don't you wrap it up?
Yeah, why don't I do this? And this isn't even a question; it's just a prompt. And I know Jeff, you wanted to do this. Anything that you guys want to plug before we get out of here? And I know Jeff, you wrote a book, so why don't you go ahead and do that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, I just had a book released today called The $100 Million Playbook. It goes into detail of how we help founders and get investors 4 or 5x MOIC over 24 months.
Ollie, what about you? You don't have to plug anything, but if people want to get in touch with you or anything you want to leave us with as something to think about, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, happy to connect with anybody who's interested to know more about this space. And so I like before I started my search fund, I did like a quick investment thesis comparing the British market, the Dutch market, and the Egyptian market. That's like where I lived a big part of my life and have familiarity with in terms of investment. And yeah, like happy to share any knowledge or any insights or any connections in the ecosystem outside the US.
Anything for you guys? Anything you want to plug shamelessly or shamefully? Go for it.
Yeah, just we're actually working on our final close for the Frontier Direct Care Series B that we just did an initial close in December. So please please reach out if you're interested in learning more about the opportunity, or just getting involved in our deal flow.
Oh, well, I'll just round
We're
it
not
out.
finished yet. Last guy.
Yeah, so Search Fund Ventures, we're also in the second close of our Fund 1. And we also have a website called SMB Investor Network, like small, medium-sized business, investornetwork.com. And we share co-invest opportunities for people that are looking for deal-by-deal micro PE investments.
Dan, anything you want to talk about? Any fancy?
No, you could. You're opening Pandora's box. I think we're good. Vaccines, maybe? No, I'm just kidding. All right, I'm good. Thank you, guys. I would just say give a round of applause for these guys that are in the room and joining you digitally. That's my favorite thing to
Fantastic.
do.
Great job, guys.